Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient Egyptian pharaohs and their absolutely bonkers burial customs. Turns out, when you're basically considered a living god, dying becomes the ultimate couple's vacation. Except nobody's coming back and the luggage requirements are insane. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. For you, it's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together into the world's most expensive and permanent sleepovers. Let's start with the biggest misconception about pharaonic burials. Most people think pharaohs were buried with their wives because of some romantic, eternal love story, like ancient Egypt was running some kind of afterlife dating service. In reality, it was more like the ultimate corporate merger, except the stock options were literally golden and the severance package was eternal servitude. Think of it less like Romeo and Juliet and more like The Godfather meets Extreme. Couponing. This wasn't some touching tribute to marital bliss. It was a carefully calculated power play involving politics, religion, economics, and a healthy dose of if I'm going down, I'm taking everyone with me. The pharaohs weren't hopeless romantics. They were middle management trying to maintain their org chart in the afterlife. Ancient Egypt from roughly 3100 BCE to 30 BCE wasn't some mystical land of cat worship and pyramid schemes. Well, okay, there were actually literal pyramid schemes, but stay with me. The Nile Valley wasn't a peaceful kingdom where everyone just happened to agree that one guy should be treated like a god. It was a complex bureaucratic nightmare, where the pharaoh's divine status was the only thing keeping the whole system from collapsing into chaos. The priesthood controlled religious legitimacy, the military controlled actual power, and the pharaoh had to balance both while pretending to be the earthly incarnation of various gods who, let's be honest, had some pretty specific demands about interior decorating. If you thought modern politics were complicated, imagine trying to run a country where your approval ratings were literally tied to whether the Nile flooded properly, and your political opponents could claim the gods were angry because you chose the wrong wallpaper for your tomb. The pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were CEOs of Egypt, Inc., high priests of a complex religious system, military commanders, and international diplomats, all while maintaining the fiction that they were divinely appointed middle managers between the gods and regular people. And just like any good middle manager, when it came time for the ultimate performance review, death, they wanted to make sure their entire team was coming with them to the afterlife board meeting. Take Pharaoh Djer, one of the earliest rulers we have solid evidence for, around 3000 BCE. This guy's burial is like the ancient equivalent of a tech startup. Founder going public, except instead of stock options, everyone gets mummified. Djer's tomb at Abydos wasn't just his final resting place. It was a corporate retreat that nobody ever left. But here's where it gets weird, and we're talking about ancient Egypt, so the bar for weird is already pretty high. Djer wasn't buried alone with just his wife. Oh no, that would be too simple. This guy took 338 people with him to the afterlife. That's not a burial. That's a hostile takeover of the underworld. His tomb complex looked like someone took a small town and decided to play the ultimate game of musical chairs. Except when the music stopped, everyone stayed seated forever. The really kicker? These weren't all volunteers. Some were probably his wives, plural, because apparently monogamy was an on-brand for divine kingship. But most were servants, guards, craftsmen, and probably his accountant, because even in the afterlife, someone needs to balance the books. One pharaoh's tomb allegedly contained his entire kitchen staff, which makes you wonder, was the afterlife catering really that bad that you needed to bring your own chef? The consequences of this practice were immediate and obvious. It became the ultimate employee retention program. Work for the pharaoh, and you're literally guaranteed job security for eternity. This wasn't just about one king's megalomaniacal approach to event planning. These mass burials established a precedent that would define Egyptian royal death culture for millennia. We're talking about a system where being promoted to close associate of the pharaoh came with the ultimate non-compete clause. You literally couldn't work for anyone else ever again, including yourself. The practice affected thousands of people across Egyptian history, from queens and concubines to servants and pets. Yes, pets. Apparently, even the royal cats weren't exempt from the corporate culture. This wasn't just about ensuring the pharaoh had company in the afterlife. It was about maintaining the political and social hierarchy beyond death, because heaven forbid the pharaoh should have to make his own sandwich for eternity. The implications rippled through Egyptian society, affecting everything from marriage politics to career choices. Imagine updating your LinkedIn profile, seeking challenging opportunities in royal service, willing to relocate permanently to the afterlife. The complexity and contradictions of this system would shape Egyptian culture, religion, and politics for over 3,000 years. But Djer's mass burial extravaganza was just the beginning. The practice would evolve, become more sophisticated, and occasionally more humane. Though humane is a relative term when we're talking about mandatory eternal employment. The real story lies in how this bizarre system actually worked in practice. The divine kingship burial system wasn't just ancient Egypt's version of bring your daughter to work day. It was a comprehensive afterlife insurance policy with the worst terms and conditions ever written. Unlike our modern assumption that these burials were about love or loyalty, the reality was far more practical and terrifying. Pharaohs were buried with their wives and retinues because Egyptian theology demanded it, and Egyptian politics made it inevitable. C. According to Egyptian religious doctrine, the pharaoh wasn't just a king who happened to be divine. He was literally the living embodiment of Horus, son of Osiris, cosmic middle management in the great corporate hierarchy of the universe. When he died, he needed to maintain his staff in the afterlife to continue his divine duties. Think of it as the ultimate remote work arrangement, except the office is a tomb and nobody gets to log off. Ever. This developed because early Egyptian society was built around the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order and balance. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining this balance, and apparently, the gods were very specific about organizational charts. You couldn't just show up to the afterlife as a solo act. You needed your entire support system. It's like being told you can go to heaven, but only if you bring your entire HR department with you. Why did this system develop? Simple. Early pharaohs faced a legitimacy crisis. When you're claiming to be a god king in a world full of people who are pretty sure you're just a guy with a fancy hat, you need to really commit to the bit. And nothing says, I'm definitely divine, quite like having the power to take your entire household with you when you die. It was the ultimate power move. Not just I can have you killed, but I can have you killed and then make you work for me forever. Take Queen Mernith, around 2950 BCE, who basically wrote the handbook on, if you can't beat them, join them. Permanently. When her husband died, instead of the traditional widow moves to Florida retirement plan, she decided to double down on the family business. Her tomb at Abydos contains 41 subsidiary burials, which sounds like a lot until you realize that's actually showing restraint by early dynastic standards. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply disturbing. The people buried with Mernith weren't just randomly selected. Archaeological evidence suggests they were specifically chosen based on their roles in her household. We're talking about her personal servants, her guards, her craftsmen, and yes, probably her husband's other wives, because apparently polygamy was complicated enough in life without adding death to the mix. One tomb excavation allegedly revealed a servant buried with a half-finished piece of jewelry still in his hands, which tells you everything you need about the timing of these arrangements. Imagine getting a performance review that ends with, "Great work on the bracelet, Johnson. Also, pack light because you're coming with me to eternity." The level of advanced planning required for these burials suggests they weren't spur of the moment decisions. This was HR policy implemented with the efficiency of a modern corporation and the moral flexibility of a medieval warlord. Another fascinating example is the tomb complex of Pharaoh Djer, where archaeologists found evidence of what appears to be a carefully orchestrated mass burial event. The positioning of the bodies suggests they weren't just killed and dumped. They were arranged according to their social hierarchy, even in death. The queen's servants were buried near the queen. The pharaoh's bodyguards were positioned around his burial chamber, and the kitchen staff were apparently relegated to what we might call the service entrance of the afterlife. But perhaps the most telling detail is the evidence of last meals found in some of these subsidiary burials. These people were fed elaborate final dinners before their eternal employment began, which is either the most thoughtful HR policy ever implemented or the most terrifying dinner invitation in human history. Thanks for coming to dinner. Hope you enjoyed the wine, because it's the last thing you'll ever taste as a living person. The scale of these operations required massive logistical coordination. We're talking about embalming dozens of people simultaneously, preparing individual burial chambers, and coordinating the timing so everyone could be interred together. It was like planning a wedding, except instead of "till death do us part," it was "death is where we really get started." The ancient Egyptians developed what was essentially a death industry, complete with specialized workers, standardized procedures, and presumably very comprehensive liability waivers. But it wasn't that simple, because when has anything involving ancient Egypt ever been simple? The archaeological record reveals some fascinating contradictions that complicate our understanding of these practices. For instance, while early dynastic tombs show clear evidence of mass human sacrifice, later periods show a shift toward symbolic representation and willing participation. Some tombs contain evidence that certain individuals were buried alive, but with breathing apparatus and food supplies, suggesting either a belief that they might survive the journey to the afterlife or a really twisted form of life insurance. Other burials show signs that people were killed elsewhere and then transported to the tomb, while some appear to have died of natural causes shortly before the pharaoh's death, which raises the uncomfortable question of whether some people were kept on standby for royal deaths. Then there's the gender politics angle, which gets complicated fast. While we often hear about pharaohs being buried with their wives, the reality is that many pharaohs had multiple wives, and the selection process for who got to accompany the pharaoh to eternity appears to have been based on political alliances rather than romantic attachment. It's like a really morbid version of The Bachelor, except instead of getting a rose, you get a one-way ticket to the afterlife. The contradictions extend to social class as well. Some subsidiary burials contain individuals who were clearly wealthy and important in their own right, buried with their own grave goods and honored positions. Others appear to be lower status individuals who were essentially treated as human furniture. This suggests that the practice wasn't uniformly applied. Some people were honored partners in the pharaoh's eternal journey, while others were basically cosmic luggage. Modern analogies help explain the complexity. Imagine if modern corporate culture demanded that when a CEO retired, their entire C-suite had to retire with them. But the selection process was based on a combination of performance reviews, office politics, and astrological compatibility. The system had rules, but those rules were applied inconsistently, and were subject to interpretation by people who literally believed they were gods. The result was a society where proximity to power came with existential risks that make modern corporate stress look like a spa day. Being promoted to the Pharaoh's inner circle wasn't just about better pay and corner office privileges. It was about signing up for a lifetime contract that extended well beyond your actual lifetime. The immediate families of these buried retainers were affected in ways we're still uncovering. Some received compensation or elevated status as families of the chosen ones, while others were essentially left to fend for themselves after losing their primary breadwinner to royal death obligations. Egyptian records suggest that some families considered it an honor to have a member selected for eternal service, while others, well, let's just say the ancient Egyptian equivalent of workers' compensation claims were probably pretty interesting. The practice created a ripple effect throughout Egyptian society. People began to carefully consider their career choices with mortality in mind. Do you really want that promotion to royal cupbearer if it comes with mandatory afterlife employment? Some evidence suggests that certain positions in the royal household became difficult to fill, leading to what we might call the world's first death benefit recruitment crisis. Institutionally, the practice required the development of specialized religious and administrative systems. The priesthood had to develop elaborate rituals and theological justifications for mass human sacrifice. The royal administration had to create policies for selecting who would be buried with the pharaoh and how their families would be compensated. It was bureaucracy applied to the ultimate HR challenge. How do you manage employees who will literally never be able to quit? The long-term implications were profound. The practice established precedents for royal power that would influence Egyptian kingship for millennia. It created a culture where the pharaoh's divine status was reinforced not just by religious doctrine, but by the very real demonstration that their power extended beyond death. When your boss can literally draft you for eternal service, it tends to cut down on workplace complaints about overtime policies. The system also had unintended consequences for Egyptian religious development. The focus on elaborate afterlife preparations for the royal household led to innovations in mummification, tomb construction, and funerary practices that would become central to Egyptian culture. In trying to solve the problem of maintaining royal staff in the afterlife, the Egyptians accidentally invented one of history's most sophisticated death care industries. Meanwhile, as the divine kingship burial system was establishing itself as the world's most permanent employment policy, Egyptian society was developing increasingly sophisticated ways to justify, organize, and eventually moderate these practices. The theological framework that made mass royal burials seem not just acceptable but necessary was evolving into a complex system of beliefs about death, divinity, and social hierarchy that would define Egyptian culture for thousands of years. But the practical challenges of organizing these massive funeral operations were pushing Egyptian administrative capabilities to their limits. You can't just kill dozens of people and bury them with proper ceremony without developing some serious logistical expertise. The Egyptians were becoming the ancient world's experts in large-scale event planning, except their events had a 100% fatality rate, and the guest list was non-negotiable. The religious justifications for these practices were also becoming more elaborate and sophisticated, as the priesthood worked to develop theological frameworks that could explain why the gods demanded such extreme measures. This wasn't just about royal power anymore. It was about cosmic necessity, divine mandate, and the maintenance of universal order through what was essentially the world's most elaborate funeral planning process. Before we dive deeper into the evolution of burial practices, let's pause for some of the most entertaining stories that emerged from 3 millennia of Egyptian death bureaucracy. Because when you're running the ancient world's most complex funeral industry, things are bound to go hilariously wrong occasionally. Take the case of what archaeologists diplomatically call the administrative confusion of Dynasty 6, but which was essentially the ancient equivalent of a shipping error that nobody wanted to admit. During the reign of Pharaoh Djer, around 2345 BCE, the royal embalming workshop apparently mixed up two sets of burial preparations, one for the pharaoh's beloved pet baboon, and one for his least favorite wife, Queen Ibut. The mistake wasn't discovered until the funeral procession was already underway, when alert mourners noticed that the queen's sarcophagus seemed unusually small, and the baboon's burial chamber was surprisingly elaborate. Palace records suggest that the mix-up occurred because both the queen and the baboon had similar-sounding ceremonial names, and the embalming supervisor was apparently having vision problems that he was too embarrassed to mention to his divine employer Dodd, rather than halt the ceremony and admit the error, which would have been cosmically embarrassing for everyone involved. The royal administrators made an executive decision to proceed with the mixed-up arrangements while quietly preparing corrective paperwork for the afterlife. Official records indicate that Queen Ibut was posthumously promoted to Sacred Baboon of the Eastern Horizon, while the actual baboon received the honorary title of Minor Queen of Household Management. The theological implications of this bureaucratic disaster required months of priestly consultation to resolve. How do you explain to the gods that you've accidentally made a baboon into a queen and a queen into a baboon? The solution involved developing elaborate religious justifications for the transformative power of death, essentially arguing that the mix-up was actually evidence of divine will rather than administrative incompetence. One of the most poignant stories from the Egyptian burial archives involves a young scribe named Kamwaset, not to be confused with the famous prince of the same name, who found himself accidentally enrolled in the Eternal Employment Program due to what we might charitably call a clerical error. Kamwaset had been working as a temporary administrative assistant in the Royal Burial Planning Department, essentially an ancient intern whose job involved filing paperwork and organizing ceremonial supplies. When Pharaoh Djer died unexpectedly during Dynasty 5, the burial planning team was working under enormous pressure to organize appropriate eternal employment arrangements within the traditional 70-day mummification period. In the chaos of last-minute funeral preparations, someone apparently misread Kamwaset's employment status and included him on the list of personnel designated for eternal service. By the time the error was discovered, the young scribe had already been processed through the preliminary stages of mummification preparation, including the ceremonial farewell to earthly concerns ritual that was supposed to prepare eternal employees for their transition to afterlife duties. The administrative challenge was unprecedented. How do you unenroll someone from eternal employment once the paperwork has been processed and the religious ceremonies have begun? The solution required innovative theological interpretation and creative, bureaucratic problem-solving that would have impressed modern corporate lawyers. The priests developed a special administrative resurrection ceremony that could reverse the effects of preliminary eternal employment processing, while the royal administrators created new procedural safeguards to prevent similar mix-ups in future royal deaths. Kamwaset became the first documented case of someone being fired from the afterlife before actually dying, which required creating entirely new categories of employment status and ceremonial protocols. The young scribe apparently took his brush with eternal employment with remarkable good humor, later writing detailed memoirs of his experience that included practical advice for avoiding similar bureaucratic mishaps. His recommendations included always double-checking your employment status before royal deaths, maintaining clear documentation of temporary versus permanent work assignments, and never volunteering for overtime during funeral planning periods. Camera sets. Story became legendary within Egyptian administrative circles as an example of how even the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems could break down under pressure, and how creative problem-solving could resolve seemingly impossible institutional challenges. He later became a successful funeral industry consultant, specializing in employment classification and ceremonial safety protocols. Perhaps no episode better illustrates the absurd extremes of Egyptian burial culture than the legendary pyramid competition of Dynasty 4, when three different pharaohs essentially engaged in the ancient equivalent of a reality TV show about who could build the most impressive eternal office building. The competition began when Pharaoh Sneferu built not one but 3 pyramids, apparently because his first 2 attempts didn't meet his standards for appropriate divine architecture. This set an unfortunate precedent for his son, Khufu, who decided that building just one pyramid, even a really big one, might seem insufficiently committed to the whole divine kingship concept. Khufu's Great Pyramid project became what modern project managers would recognize as a classic case of scope creep combined with competitive ego inflation. What started as a straightforward royal burial facility evolved into a massive construction project that required reorganizing the entire Egyptian economy around pyramid building. The project employed tens of thousands of workers, consumed enormous resources, and created logistical challenges that made modern infrastructure projects look like weekend home improvement endeavors. But Khufu's son, Khafre, couldn't just build a smaller pyramid without losing face. So he developed a creative solution. Build a slightly smaller pyramid but place it on higher ground, creating the optical illusion that his monument was actually larger than his father's. This was essentially the ancient equivalent of strategic camera angles combined with an architectural one-upmanship. The competition reached its peak with Pharaoh Menkaure, who realized that the pyramid arms race was getting economically unsustainable, but couldn't simply build a modest tomb without appearing to admit defeat. His solution was to build a smaller pyramid but make it so architecturally sophisticated and artistically refined that it would represent quality over quantity, essentially the luxury boutique approach to eternal accommodation. The pyramid competition created lasting changes in Egyptian burial practices, establishing new standards for royal monument construction that influenced tomb design for centuries. It also demonstrated the economic limits of competitive funeral planning and led to more sustainable approaches to royal burial architecture. Archaeological evidence suggests that the competition was viewed with a mixture of pride and exhaustion by contemporary Egyptians, who apparently appreciated the impressive monuments while also recognizing that pyramid building was consuming resources that could have been used for other governmental priorities. Later pharaohs learned to balance eternal accommodation needs with practical economic constraints, leading to more sustainable approaches to royal death planning. One of the most revealing insights into Egyptian burial practices comes from the tomb of an administrator named Ptahhotep, whose burial arrangements included what appears to be the ancient world's first comprehensive job description for afterlife. Employment, complete with performance expectations, reporting structures, and what we might recognize as divine human resources policies. Ptahhotep's tomb inscriptions describe his eternal duties in remarkable detail. He was expected to maintain celestial administrative records, coordinate divine scheduling for the pharaoh's afterlife meetings, and manage the cosmic filing system that tracked the performance of various gods and goddesses. His job responsibilities included ensuring that the pharaoh's divine paperwork was properly processed, that ceremonial appointments were scheduled efficiently, and that the eternal bureaucracy operated according to appropriate professional standards. The tomb reliefs show Ptahhotep performing various administrative tasks in the afterlife, including what appears to be a divine staff meeting where he's presenting reports to assembled gods, while the pharaoh reviews celestial performance metrics. One particularly detailed scene shows him organizing what looks like an eternal office party, complete with properly arranged seating charts that respect both divine hierarchy and cosmic protocol requirements. Perhaps most fascinating are the tomb's detailed instructions for afterlife professional development, including guidelines for maintaining administrative skills across eternity, procedures for adapting to changing divine management styles, and protocols for handling disagreements between different categories of gods. Ptahhotep had apparently anticipated that even eternal employment would require ongoing professional growth and institutional adaptation. The inscriptions also include what might be the ancient world's first employee handbook for celestial service, covering topics like appropriate dress codes for divine meetings, proper procedures for handling confidential cosmic information, and guidelines for managing relationships with colleagues who happen to be gods. The level of detail suggests that Ptahhotep took his eternal employment obligations very seriously and wanted to ensure he would be prepared for any administrative challenges the afterlife might present. Modern management consultants studying Ptahhotep's tomb have noted that his approach to afterlife employment preparation demonstrates remarkably sophisticated understanding of organizational behavior, professional development, and the importance of clear communication in complex bureaucratic environments. His eternal job description has become a classic example of how thoughtful planning and detailed documentation can help ensure professional success even in the most unusual employment circumstances. If the early dynastic burial system was ancient Egypt's version of mandatory fun, then what developed during the Old Kingdom was more like death by committee, a sophisticated, bureaucratic approach to eternal employment that would make modern corporate restructuring look like a casual Friday policy change dated by around 2700 BCE. The Egyptians had apparently realized that mass human sacrifice, while definitely establishing your credentials as a god king, was also really expensive and logistically nightmarish. So they did what any sensible civilization would do. They invented middle management for the afterlife. Instead of just killing everyone and hoping for the best, they developed a complex system of symbolic substitution, professional mourners, and what we might call afterlife consultants. This became important because Egypt was getting more sophisticated as a society, and with sophistication comes the kind of people who ask uncomfortable questions like, "Excuse me, Your Divine Majesty, but have you considered the economic impact of removing our entire skilled workforce from the land of the living?" Turns out even god kings have to deal with labor shortage concerns. The shift wasn't sudden. It was more like watching a startup evolve into a Fortune 500 company. Except instead of quarterly earnings reports, they were optimizing eternal damnation policies. The Egyptians began developing alternatives to direct human sacrifice that would still satisfy the theological requirements while addressing practical concerns like, how do we run a kingdom if we keep burying all our competent people? This evolution reflected broader changes in Egyptian society. The country was becoming more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more economically complex. The pharaohs couldn't just rule through divine terror anymore. They needed actual administrative competence. And administrative competence is hard to maintain when your promotion track includes mandatory death. So the burial practices had to evolve to match the changing needs of Egyptian governance, which led to some truly creative solutions to the problem of staffing the afterlife. Consider Pharaoh Djer and his architect Imhotep around 2650 BCE, basically the ancient world's first recorded case of a boss taking full credit for his employee's work. Except in this case, the employee got to live to see it. Djer's burial complex at Saqqara represents a revolutionary approach to royal death planning. Instead of taking his entire court with him, he took their job descriptions. the step pyramid complex wasn't just a tomb. It was a fully functional afterlife office building, complete with ceremonial courtyards for eternal meetings, storage facilities for cosmic paperwork, and even what appears to be a divine reception area. Archaeological evidence suggests that instead of burying dozens of actual people, Djer's tomb was staffed with elaborate reliefs and statues representing his entire administration. It was like replacing your actual HR department with very detailed organizational charts, except these charts were carved in stone and blessed by priests. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean this is why we can't have nice things interesting. Imhotep, the genius architect who designed this masterpiece of ancient urban planning, wasn't buried with Djer at all. He got his own tomb, his own cult, and eventually his own deification. Apparently, being really good at your job could earn you an exemption from the whole eternal servitude thing. It was the ancient equivalent of getting stock options instead of a severance package, except the stock options included becoming a god. Another fascinating case study is Queen Hedefires, mother of Pharaoh Khufu. Yes, the guy with the Great Pyramid. Her burial represents the ultimate evolution of the bring your stuff instead of your staff approach. Instead of human retainers, her tomb was packed with the most elaborate furniture collection in ancient history. We're talking about beds, chairs, jewelry boxes, and carrying chairs that were so ornate they probably required their own security detail. The really clever part? Much of her furniture was designed to be assembled and disassembled, suggesting that the Egyptians had invented flat-pack afterlife furniture about 4,000 years before IKEA. Her tomb contained what was essentially an eternal home office setup, complete with everything she needed to maintain her divine administrative duties without requiring any actual employees to die for the privilege of helping her. One tomb inscription allegedly describes a servant who was promoted to eternal service through symbolic representation, which is possibly the most euphemistic job termination notice in human history. Instead of being killed, this person was represented in the tomb by a detailed statue and a comprehensive job description carved in hieroglyphs. It was like being replaced by your own Wikipedia page, except your Wikipedia page got to spend eternity in a really nice tomb. Perhaps the most telling example is the tomb of Pharaoh Sneferu, who apparently took the symbolic representation concept and ran with it. His burial complex contains detailed models of entire workshops, complete with tiny figurines performing various tasks. It's like he decided to take his entire economy with him to the afterlife, but in miniature form. The ancient Egyptians had invented the world's first corporate diorama, and it was designed to function for eternity. The evolution wasn't uniform, though. Some pharaohs embraced the new symbolic approach, while others maintained more traditional practices. This led to what we might call afterlife inequality. Some royal burials featured elaborate symbolic representations and minimal human sacrifice, while others maintained the old-school approach of, if you work for me in life, you work for me in death. It was like having different companies with wildly different death benefits packages, except changing jobs wasn't really an option once you'd signed up. This wasn't an isolated case of Egyptian innovation. It represented a broader pattern of problem-solving that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia. The Egyptians had a remarkable talent for taking completely insane ideas and bureaucratizing them into manageable systems. They were the ancient world's masters of finding practical solutions to impractical theological requirements. The pattern goes like this. Start with a religious mandate that creates massive practical problems. Develop increasingly sophisticated workarounds, and eventually create a system so complex that it requires its own specialized workforce. Other examples include their approach to mummification, originally reserved for pharaohs, eventually democratized into a thriving death care industry. Their administrative system, started as royal household management, became the world's first comprehensive bureaucracy, and their approach to monumental architecture began as tomb building, evolved into a construction industry that employed thousands. Why did this pattern exist? Simple. The Egyptians were practical people trapped in an impractical religious system. They believed their pharaohs were gods, but they also needed their pharaohs to actually govern a complex society. They needed to maintain cosmic order, but they also needed to maintain agricultural production. They had to satisfy the theological requirements for royal burials, but they also needed to keep enough skilled workers alive to maintain civilization. The social and political factors that enabled this evolution were fascinating. Egypt's increasing wealth allowed for more elaborate symbolic substitutions. You can't afford detailed tomb reliefs and elaborate furniture if you're a subsistence society. The growing power of the priesthood created a class of religious professionals who could develop theological justifications for new practices. And the expanding administrative class created a pool of educated people who could design and implement complex symbolic systems. Compared to other ancient civilizations, the Egyptians were remarkably innovative in finding alternatives to human sacrifice. While other cultures maintained practices of ritual killing well into historical periods, the Egyptians were developing symbolic substitutions and bureaucratic workarounds. They were essentially the ancient world's first civilization to apply systems thinking to religious obligations, which is either admirable pragmatism or really disturbing efficiency, depending on your perspective. The economic factors were crucial too. Mass human sacrifice is expensive. You lose productive workers. You need elaborate burial preparations for multiple people, and you create social instability. Symbolic representation was cost-effective. One really good sculptor could create eternal servants that wouldn't require food, housing, or workers' compensation. It was the ancient equivalent of replacing your customer service department with chatbots, except the chatbots were carved in stone and blessed by priests. The effects of this evolution were profound and far-reaching, reshaping not just Egyptian burial practices, but the entire structure of Egyptian society. The pharaohs were the clear beneficiaries. They maintained their divine status and their afterlife staffing requirements without decimating their actual workforce. It was the ultimate win-win scenario. Cosmic legitimacy without economic catastrophe. The priesthood also benefited enormously from this system. The development of symbolic substitution required religious expertise, theological innovation, and ritual specialization. Priests became not just intermediaries between gods and humans, but professional consultants for afterlife logistics. They were essentially running the ancient world's first death planning service, complete with customized packages and premium options. But the real winners were the skilled workers and administrators, who no longer faced mandatory death as a career hazard. The shift to symbolic representation meant that being good at your job became a path to advancement rather than a death sentence. This created incentives for professional development that would drive Egyptian innovation for centuries. One job. Security doesn't literally depend on your boss staying alive. People tend to be more creative and productive. The unintended consequences were equally significant. The elaborate tomb preparations required by symbolic burial created entire industries. Sculptors, painters, furniture makers, architects, and ritual specialists. Egypt developed what was essentially a death economy, employing thousands of people in the business of preparing pharaohs for eternity. It was like if modern society organized itself around funeral planning, except the funerals were for people who were supposedly gods, and the planning took decades. The system also had interesting effects on Egyptian social mobility. Skilled craftsmen who worked on royal tombs could achieve considerable status and wealth. Some tomb builders and architects became celebrities in their own right, with their own cults and eventual deification. It was the ancient world's first example of the creative economy, where artistic and technical skills could literally elevate you to divine status. How this shaped future developments is fascinating. The symbolic burial system established patterns of artistic representation, religious symbolism, and bureaucratic organization that would define Egyptian culture for thousands of years. The elaborate tomb reliefs and sculptures weren't just pretty decorations. They were functional components of a cosmic bureaucracy designed to operate for eternity. The modern parallels are striking, like contemporary corporations that have evolved from simple partnerships to complex organizational structures with elaborate symbolic hierarchies. The Egyptians had transformed their death culture from simple human sacrifice to sophisticated symbolic representation. They had essentially invented corporate culture for the afterlife, complete with organizational charts carved in stone. Yet, even as the Egyptians were perfecting their symbolic approach to afterlife staffing, the practical realities of royal succession were creating new challenges that would test the limits of their bureaucratic creativity. The symbolic burial system worked great when pharaohs died at convenient times with clear succession plans. But Egyptian history was about to demonstrate that royal deaths rarely happen according to schedule. The rise of more complex dynastic politics, foreign invasions, and internal power struggles would force the Egyptians to adapt their burial practices to increasingly chaotic circumstances. What happens when a pharaoh dies unexpectedly? What if there are competing claims to the throne? What if the designated heir is a child, or a woman, or someone who doesn't buy into the whole divine kingship concept? The next phase of Egyptian burial evolution would be driven not by theological innovation or economic efficiency, but by raw political necessity. The Egyptians were about to discover that even the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems can break down when faced with the fundamental unpredictability of human ambition, mortality, and the occasional family feud that spans generations. The real test of their afterlife management system was just beginning. By the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2180 BCE, the Egyptian royal burial system had reached what we might call peak bureaucratic sophistication, which is exactly when everything went spectacularly wrong. The carefully managed symbolic burial system that had worked so well for centuries was about to collide headfirst with the one thing ancient bureaucrats couldn't plan for: a complete governmental meltdown combined with climate change, economic collapse, and the kind of dynastic chaos that makes modern political scandals look like church picnics. The situation had reached a breaking point because the Egyptians had built their entire political system around the assumption that pharaohs were divinely appointed, eternally legitimate, and generally competent at basic tasks, like keeping the Nile flooding properly and maintaining cosmic order. When several pharaohs in a row failed spectacularly at these supposedly divine responsibilities, the whole system started to crack. Like a poorly built pyramid, the key players involved read like a cast list for the world's most dysfunctional family reunion. Weak pharaohs who couldn't control their own governors, provincial nobles who decided they were basically pharaohs themselves, priests who started picking sides in political disputes, and various foreign groups who noticed that Egypt was having what we might diplomatically call internal difficulties, and decided to help themselves to Egyptian territory and resources. The stakes involved weren't just political, they were cosmic. If the pharaoh's divine legitimacy was questioned, then the entire religious and social system that justified the royal burial practices was also in question. Suddenly, the elaborate theological frameworks that had been developed to explain why pharaohs needed eternal staff and symbolic servants were being challenged by the practical reality that these supposedly divine kings couldn't even manage basic governance. It was like discovering that your CEO, who's been taking half the company with him to retirement, actually doesn't know how to read financial statements. The crisis came to a head during what historians politely call the First Intermediate Period, but which was essentially Egypt's first experience with complete governmental breakdown combined with the ancient equivalent of a reality TV show about royal succession. The catalyst was Pharaoh Pepi II, who had the audacity to reign for 94 years, which sounds impressive until you realize that by the end, he was basically a very expensive mummy who occasionally signed documents. The build-up to disaster was like watching a slow-motion train wreck if trains were made of divine kingship and the tracks were carved from religious legitimacy. Pepi II's reign had started promisingly enough. He'd maintained the traditional burial practices, kept the nobles happy with appropriate honors and tomb privileges, and generally managed to keep the divine kingship brand intact. But 94 years is a long time to maintain the fiction that you're a god, especially when you start showing clear signs of being a very mortal old man who sometimes forgot what century he was in. The key moments read like a political thriller written by someone with a very dark sense of humor. Around year 80 of Pepi's reign, provincial governors started building tombs for themselves that were larger and more elaborate than the pharaoh's own monuments. This wasn't just architectural one-upmanship. It was a direct challenge to the theological principle that only the divine pharaoh deserved elaborate afterlife accommodations. Imagine if middle managers started demanding better retirement packages than the CEO, except the retirement packages involved eternal divine status, and the CEO was supposed to be literally immortal. The provincial nobles weren't content with just building bigger tombs. They started adopting royal burial practices for themselves. They began including their own servants in their burials, using royal titles in their tomb inscriptions, and generally acting like they were running their own mini-kingdoms with their own divine legitimacy. One governor allegedly had himself buried with a retinue that included musicians, dancers, and what appears to have been his entire kitchen staff, because apparently even local nobles had caught the eternal employment bug. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, Pepi II's court was dealing with the practical challenges of maintaining royal burial traditions, when the pharaoh was clearly past his expiration date, but stubbornly refusing to expire. The priests had to develop increasingly creative theological explanations for why their living god was showing obvious signs of mortality, while the royal administrators had to figure out succession planning for a pharaoh who'd outlived most of his potential heirs. The climax came when Pepi II finally died, and nobody could agree on who should succeed him. The official succession records from this period read like a soap opera written by committee. There were competing claims from multiple family lines, provincial governors who declared themselves pharaohs, and at least 3 different people claiming to be the legitimate heir to the divine throne. Each claimant insisted that they deserved the traditional royal burial treatment, which created the surreal situation of multiple people planning elaborate eternal employment packages while simultaneously trying to kill each other. The immediate aftermath was chaos on a scale that makes modern political transitions look like model exercises in good governance. Different regions of Egypt were literally supporting different pharaohs, each with their own burial preparations, their own divine legitimacy claims, and their own ideas about who deserved to take their staff with them to the afterlife. Archaeological evidence suggests that some nobles were hedging their bets by preparing multiple burial sites with different royal names, just in case they needed to switch loyalties posthumously. One particularly dramatic incident involved a nobleman who apparently prepared burial arrangements with 3 different pharaonic claimants, which required maintaining 3 separate sets of eternal servants and 3 different theological justifications for his afterlife employment needs. When one of his pharaoh candidates was killed in battle, he had to quickly reorganize his entire death plan, which included releasing some of his designated eternal servants from their obligations and reassigning others to different afterlife. Duties. It was like having to completely restructure your retirement portfolio, except the stakes were eternal damnation, and the market volatility involved actual warfare. The response to this governmental meltdown was swift, varied, and generally made everything worse. The priesthood, faced with the collapse of their entire theological framework, split into factions supporting different pharaonic claimants. Some priests maintained traditional positions about divine kingship and royal burial privileges, while others began developing new theological frameworks that could accommodate multiple pharaohs or even, heretically, question whether pharaohs were actually divine at all. The immediate consequences were catastrophic for the burial industry. Professional embalmers found themselves with multiple clients claiming royal privileges. Tomb builders were working for competing pharaohs who might not survive long enough to actually use their tombs. And the entire symbolic representation industry was thrown into chaos as nobody could agree on which symbols represented legitimate divine authority. Provincial nobles, seeing opportunity in the chaos, began declaring themselves pharaohs of their own regions and adopting full royal burial practices. This created a situation where Egypt had dozens of people claiming divine kingship, each with their own elaborate afterlife staffing requirements. The traditional system of centralized divine authority had been replaced by what was essentially a franchise model of divine kingship, except the franchise fees were paid in human lives and eternal servitude. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The governors who had declared independence found themselves in the awkward position of having to maintain divine legitimacy while also dealing with practical governance issues like taxation, defense, and keeping their own nobles from declaring independence from them. Many of these local pharaohs adopted increasingly extreme burial practices to prove their divine credentials, leading to what historians call competitive eternal employment, essentially an arms race in afterlife staffing that devastated local populations. The long-term implications were profound. The first intermediate period demonstrated that the divine kingship system was vulnerable to practical challenges, and that the elaborate burial practices that had been developed to support royal legitimacy could actually become a liability when that legitimacy was questioned. The crisis forced Egyptians to confront the fundamental contradiction between their theological beliefs and political realities. International reactions were mixed but generally opportunistic. Neighboring kingdoms, seeing Egypt's internal chaos, began raiding Egyptian territory and sometimes adopting Egyptian burial practices for their own rulers. This led to the bizarre situation of foreign kings being buried with Egyptian-style eternal servants, while actual Egyptian pharaohs were struggling to maintain basic governmental functions. The Egyptian burial system, which had been designed to demonstrate divine authority, was being copied by people who were actively undermining Egyptian political power. This crisis wasn't just a political upheaval with some unfortunate side effects. On funeral planning, it revealed fundamental flaws in the entire Egyptian system of government and religious legitimacy that would influence Egyptian political development for centuries. The first intermediate period demonstrated that divine kingship was only as strong as the practical capabilities of the king, and that elaborate burial practices couldn't substitute for effective governance. What the crisis revealed about Egyptian society was both fascinating and troubling. The rapid collapse of centralized authority showed that the provincial nobility had never really bought into the divine kingship concept. They had simply found it convenient while it served their interests. When the central government weakened, they were perfectly willing to adopt royal privileges for themselves, including the controversial practice of burying servants and retainers with their deceased lords. The breakdown also exposed the economic costs of the elaborate burial system. The resources required to maintain royal burial practices, skilled craftsmen, precious materials, and yes, human lives were enormous. When multiple claimants were demanding royal treatment simultaneously, the economic burden became unsustainable. Egypt was essentially trying to maintain multiple royal courts with multiple eternal employment obligations while fighting a civil war. The long-term effects on Egyptian political thought were significant. Future pharaohs would be much more careful about succession planning, and the burial practices would be modified to be more economically sustainable and politically defensible. The crisis had taught the Egyptians that even divine kingship needed good management and practical planning. Why historians still debate this period is simple. It represents one of the earliest recorded examples of how elaborate ceremonial practices can become liabilities during political crises. The very burial customs that had been designed to demonstrate royal power had become symbols of royal excess and dysfunction. The Egyptians had learned that you can't bury your way out of a governmental crisis, no matter how divine your legitimacy claims might be. Around the main events of pharaonic burial extravaganzas, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in making this cosmic bureaucracy actually function. These weren't just background extras in the divine kingship drama. They were the people who had to figure out the practical details of eternal employment policies while maintaining their own sanity and, hopefully, their own lives. First up is Hamiunu, the architect behind the Great Pyramid, who essentially served as the ancient world's first project manager for impossible deadlines. Hamiunu wasn't just designing a tomb. He was creating a functional afterlife headquarters for Pharaoh Khufu that needed to operate for literally forever. His job description probably reads something like design eternal office space for divine CEO, including all necessary amenities for cosmic administration. Must be pyramid-shaped. Budget, unlimited. Timeline, before the pharaoh dies. Job, security. Depends on customer satisfaction in the afterlife. The fascinating thing about Hamiunu is that he managed to complete this impossible project and live to see it finished, which automatically made him one of the most successful people in Egyptian history. Most architects whose clients have unlimited budgets and divine egos don't survive the experience. But Hamiunu apparently figured out how to manage expectations, even when those expectations included build me a cosmic gateway that will function for eternity. His own tomb, while impressive, was notably free of elaborate eternal staff arrangements. Apparently, successful project management came with certain privileges, including the right to die alone. Queen Khentkaus the first represents a different aspect of the burial politics. She was essentially the ancient world's first successful corporate merger specialist. When dynastic succession got complicated during the Fourth Dynasty, Khentkaus managed to marry into the royal family, secure her own pharaonic titles, and arrange burial privileges that were normally reserved for male rulers. Her tomb complex includes provisions for her own eternal staff, which required some creative theological maneuvering since the traditional burial arrangements assumed that only male pharaohs needed comprehensive afterlife administration. But the real genius of Khentkaus was her approach to succession planning. Instead of just arranging for her own eternal employment package, she set up burial arrangements that would secure her descendants' legitimacy for generations. She was playing three-dimensional chess with divine kingship politics, ensuring that her family line would maintain royal burial privileges regardless of who actually ended up wearing the crown. It was like purchasing eternal life insurance not just for yourself, but for your entire extended family. Then there's Tehotep, a vizier whose tomb inscriptions reveal someone who was clearly thinking very carefully about the long-term implications of royal service. Tehotep's writings include what might be the world's first employee handbook for working in divine administration, complete with advice on how to manage relationships with superiors who literally believe they're gods. His tomb arrangements were notably modest for someone of his rank, suggesting that he'd figured out how to maintain high-level government positions without triggering the eternal employment clause. Tahotep's wisdom. Texts include gems like, do not be proud of your knowledge, and listen to the speech of one who speaks well, which take on a different meaning when you realize he was writing advice for people whose job performance reviews could literally determine whether they lived or died. His approach to royal service was essentially be competent but not indispensable, helpful but not irreplaceable. Survival strategies that probably saved his life and definitely influenced his relatively simple burial arrangements. These weren't isolated incidents of individual survival and success. They were part of complex webs of relationships that made the entire royal burial system possible. The connections between architects, priests, queens, and administrators created networks that could either ensure your eternal employment or your eternal exemption, depending on how well you played the game. Take the relationship between Imhotep and the priest Kamwuset, separated by over 1,000 years, but connected by their shared expertise in managing royal afterlife logistics. Imhotep had pioneered the symbolic burial approach during Djer's reign, while Kamwuset, serving under Ramesses II, had to adapt those innovations to a much more complex political environment. Both men understood that the key to surviving royal service was becoming too valuable to sacrifice. Imhotep through architectural innovation, Kamwuset through religious scholarship and restoration expertise. Their approaches created templates that other royal servants could follow. The pattern was clear. Develop specialized skills that couldn't be easily replaced. Maintain religious legitimacy through proper ceremonial observance, and cultivate relationships with multiple power centers to avoid dependency on any single royal patron. It was networking for people whose networking events might literally be their last social gathering. The political networks involved were fascinating in their complexity. Queen Hatshepsut's rise to pharaonic power required cooperation from architects like Senenmut, priests from various temples, and administrators who were willing to adapt traditional burial practices to accommodate a female pharaoh. Senenmut, her chief architect, managed to secure his own elaborate tomb while serving a ruler whose own legitimacy was constantly questioned. His success required navigating theological challenges. How do you design eternal accommodations for a female pharaoh? Political dangers. What happens if Hatshepsut's successor decides she was illegitimate? And practical construction problems. How do you build monuments that assert divine authority for someone whose divine authority is disputed? The webs of relationships extended beyond individual reigns and dynasties. Tomb builders, embalmers, and ritual specialists formed professional networks that survived political upheavals by adapting their services to new rulers, while maintaining traditional practices. These craftsmen were essentially running the ancient world's first death care industry, with standardized procedures, professional training, and the kind of job security that came from providing services that were both essential and highly specialized. One fascinating example involves the family of embalmers who served multiple dynasties during the New Kingdom. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained detailed records of their procedures, client preferences, and even what we might call customer satisfaction metrics for their mummification services. These records reveal how professional funeral services evolved to meet changing royal demands while maintaining religious legitimacy. The embalmers had to adapt their techniques for different types of royal burials: full pharaonic treatment, simplified symbolic arrangements, and the occasional emergency mummification when succession disputes meant that proper funeral planning wasn't possible. The unintended consequences of these professional networks were significant. The specialists who made royal burials possible became power brokers in their own right, capable of influencing royal decisions through their expertise. A pharaoh might be divine, but if the chief embalmer decided your mummification wasn't a priority, your afterlife prospects could be seriously compromised. This created a shadow economy around royal death services, where skilled professionals could command significant influence through their control of essential but specialized knowledge. To understand how all these supporting characters functioned within the royal burial system, you have to understand the broader cultural context of ancient Egyptian attitudes toward death, work, and social hierarchy. Daily life in ancient Egypt wasn't just influenced by royal burial practices, it was organized around them. For ordinary Egyptians, the elaborate royal burial system served as both aspiration and warning. On one hand, it demonstrated the rewards of loyal service and professional excellence. Skilled craftsmen who worked on royal tombs could achieve wealth, status, and their own elaborate burial arrangements. On the other hand, it served as a constant reminder that proximity to power came with existential risks that made modern workplace stress look like a relaxing hobby. The beliefs and attitudes that made this system possible were complex and often contradictory. Egyptians believed in the divine nature of pharaonic authority, but they also developed elaborate strategies for avoiding the more dangerous implications of that belief. They accepted that royal service might require eternal commitment, but they also created theological and practical workarounds that could minimize the personal costs of that commitment. Social structures were organized around the burial system in ways that influenced everything from career choices to family planning. Parents had to consider whether encouraging their children to pursue careers in royal service was worth the potential benefits versus the existential risks. Some families specialized in royal service across generations, developing expertise and connections that could provide both opportunities and protection. Others deliberately avoided royal connections, preferring the security of lower status to the risks of higher visibility. What was considered normal versus exceptional in this context reveals fascinating details about Egyptian social psychology. Elaborate burial preparations were normal for the wealthy. Most Egyptians who could afford it invested significant resources in afterlife accommodations. But human sacrifice and eternal employment arrangements were exceptional even within the royal context, reserved for specific circumstances and justified through elaborate religious and political reasoning. The cultural acceptance of the royal burial system depended on maintaining clear distinctions between what was expected of different social classes. Ordinary Egyptians understood that royal burial practices were different from civilian arrangements, and that difference was part of what made pharaonic authority legitimate. The supporting characters who made the system work understood these distinctions and used them to navigate the complex relationships between personal survival, professional success, and religious obligation. How this cultural context shapes specific events becomes clear when you look at how different individuals adapted to changing political circumstances while maintaining their professional and personal integrity within a system that was both deeply spiritual and intensely practical. Perhaps most fascinating about the supporting characters in the royal burial system were the ironies and contradictions that defined their lives and careers. The people who were responsible for ensuring eternal employment for pharaohs were often the same people who developed the most sophisticated strategies for avoiding eternal employment themselves. Consider the case of royal embalmers, who spent their careers preparing other people for eternal service while carefully avoiding the same fate. These specialists understood mummification better than anyone, knew exactly what eternal servitude entailed, and used that knowledge to position themselves as too valuable to sacrifice. They were essentially running the ancient equivalent of a funeral home, while making sure they never became customers. The architects present another fascinating contradiction. They designed eternal accommodations for divine rulers while creating their own modest burial arrangements that emphasize personal achievement rather than eternal service. Men like Senenmut and Haminu built monuments that were supposed to last forever, But their own tomb inscriptions focus on their professional accomplishments, rather than their relationships with specific pharaohs. They were hedging their bets, ensuring their reputations would survive, even if their royal patron's divine legitimacy didn't. The priests who developed theological justifications for royal burial practices often came from families that had carefully avoided royal service for generations. They understood the religious requirements for eternal employment better than anyone, which made them experts at finding religious exemptions and alternative arrangements. They were writing the rules for a game they had no intention of playing themselves. Perhaps the ultimate irony was that the people who made the royal burial system possible were often the least likely to be buried according to its principles. The supporting characters had front-row seats to the realities of eternal employment, and that knowledge made them extraordinarily motivated to find alternatives. Modern parallels to these contradictions are everywhere. The insurance salespeople, who know exactly which policies to avoid, the wedding planners who elope, and the financial advisors who keep their own money in simple savings accounts. The more you understand how a system really works, the more motivated you become to find ways around its worst features. Everything changed when the Egyptians encountered the Nubians during the Middle Kingdom and realized that their elaborate burial system wasn't just expensive and logistically nightmarish. It was also making them look like complete amateurs compared to their southern neighbors. The Nubians had taken Egyptian burial practices, improved them, and were now running what was essentially a more efficient version of divine kinship without the whole mass human sacrifice component that the Egyptians were still awkwardly trying to phase out. This turning point wasn't just about foreign influence. It was about the Egyptians finally admitting that their traditional approach to royal death had some serious design flaws. By around 2000 BCE, after centuries of trying to balance divine legitimacy with practical governance, the Egyptians were ready to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to demonstrate pharaonic authority than organizing elaborate suicide cults around royal funerals. The background to this change involved several key factors that had been building pressure on the traditional system. First, the economic costs of elaborate royal burials had become unsustainable. Egypt was essentially bankrupting itself to maintain funeral practices that were becoming increasingly disconnected from practical governance needs. Second, the theological justifications for human sacrifice were being challenged by priests who had developed more sophisticated religious frameworks that didn't require quite so much death. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Egyptians had realized that their burial practices were actually weakening their political system rather than strengthening it. Why this moment was different comes down to a perfect storm of practical necessity and cultural evolution. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs were dealing with serious external threats, internal political challenges, and economic pressures that required all available human resources for actual governance rather than eternal employment. They couldn't afford to keep burying their most competent administrators with dead pharaohs when they needed those same administrators to help manage living pharaohs. The key factors that led to transformation were fascinating in their complexity. Military pressure from Nubian kingdoms forced the Egyptians to maintain larger standing armies, which required keeping skilled officers alive rather than burying them with their commanders. Economic competition with other Mediterranean cultures required maintaining sophisticated trade networks, which needed experienced diplomats and merchants who couldn't fulfill their duties from inside tombs. And religious evolution within Egyptian priesthood had developed theological alternatives to human sacrifice that could maintain divine legitimacy without the associated personnel costs. The change wasn't sudden. It was more like watching a corporation slowly transition from a startup culture of everyone does everything to a mature organization with specialized departments and professional management. The Egyptians were essentially professionalizing their approach to royal death, moving from ad hoc arrangements to standardized procedures that prioritized institutional continuity over dramatic gestures. The transformation of Egyptian burial practices unfolded like the world's slowest and most bureaucratic revolution, complete with committee meetings about cosmic policy and focus groups on afterlife customer satisfaction. The change process involved multiple stakeholders, competing interests, and the kind of institutional resistance that makes modern corporate restructuring look like a casual suggestion. A box-dot resistance to change came from predictable sources. The traditional priesthood, who had built their careers around elaborate burial ceremonies. The funeral industry professionals, whose livelihoods depended on complex royal death arrangements. And conservative nobles, who viewed simplified burial practices as evidence of declining royal legitimacy. These groups formed what we might call the Eternal Employment Lobby, arguing that any reduction in burial elaboration would undermine the theological foundations of pharaonic authority. The champions of change were equally predictable, pragmatic. Administrators who were tired of losing competent colleagues to royal death policies, military commanders who needed experienced officers for actual warfare rather than eternal warfare, and innovative priests who had developed new theological frameworks that could maintain divine legitimacy without requiring quite so many human sacrifices. These reformers formed what we might call the Efficiency Coalition, arguing that Egyptian power would be better served by keeping skilled people alive. The specific steps and stages of transformation reveal fascinating details about how institutional change happens even in supposedly absolute monarchies. Phase 1 involved theological innovation. Priests developed elaborate religious justifications for symbolic representation that could satisfy divine requirements without actual human sacrifice. Phase 2 included administrative reform. The royal bureaucracy created new procedures for burial planning that emphasized symbolic arrangements over personnel arrangements. Phase 3 involved cultural adaptation. Egyptian society gradually accepted that simplified burial practices could coexist with traditional divine kingship concepts. The obstacles encountered during this process were both predictable and bizarre. Traditional priests argued that symbolic representations wouldn't be recognized by the gods, leading to theological debates about whether stone servants could perform actual afterlife duties. Funeral industry professionals worried about unemployment if burial practices became too simplified, leading to what were essentially the world's first labor disputes about death care services. And conservative nobles concerned about status markers demanded assurances that simplified royal burials wouldn't lead to simplified noble burials, because apparently social hierarchy was important even in death. Breakthrough moments came when several pharaohs died during external military crises, and their successors discovered that simplified burial arrangements actually allowed for faster transitions of power and better resource allocation for immediate political needs. Pharaoh Mentuhotep II's relatively modest burial arrangements didn't prevent him from reunifying Egypt after the first intermediate period, which provided practical evidence that elaborate eternal employment wasn't actually necessary for effective divine kingship. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in driving this change reveals the complex dynamics of institutional transformation in ancient societies. Individual pharaohs like Amenhotep I and Senusret I actively promoted burial reform as part of broader governmental modernization efforts. But their success depended on larger cultural shifts that had been building for generations. The change required both top-down leadership and bottom-up acceptance. Pharaohs had to advocate for reform, but that reform had to align with broader social and economic trends that made traditional burial practices increasingly impractical. Perhaps most importantly, The process required careful management of religious legitimacy throughout the transition. The Egyptians couldn't simply abandon their traditional burial practices without risking the collapse of the entire divine kingship system that justified pharaonic authority. Instead, they had to develop new practices that maintained theological continuity while addressing practical concerns, essentially rebranding royal death from elaborate human sacrifice ceremony to sophisticated symbolic representation event, without admitting that they were fundamentally changing the underlying concept. The success of this transformation process depended on convincing multiple constituencies that change was both necessary and legitimate. Military leaders had to be assured that simplified burial practices wouldn't undermine royal authority during succession crises. Religious authorities had to be convinced that new arrangements would satisfy divine requirements. And the general population had to accept that pharaohs could maintain their divine status without requiring elaborate human sacrifice arrangements. The new burial system that emerged from this transformation was Egyptian bureaucracy at its finest. Complex enough to maintain religious legitimacy, practical enough to avoid economic disaster, and flexible enough to adapt to changing political circumstances. The pharaohs had essentially invented the ancient world's first sustainable approach to royal death, complete with cost-benefit analysis and environmental impact assessments. How things were different under the new system was immediately apparent to anyone involved in royal administration. Instead of facing potential death sentences for successful careers in royal service, skilled administrators could now look forward to retirement packages that didn't involve mummification. The new arrangements emphasize symbolic representation, elaborate tomb decorations, and sophisticated religious ceremonies that could demonstrate divine authority without requiring actual human sacrifice. The winners in this new system were obvious. Skilled professionals who could now pursue royal careers without existential dread. Military officers who could focus on actual warfare rather than preparing for eternal warfare. And pragmatic priests who gained influence through theological innovation rather than ceremonial management of mass death events. The new burial arrangements created opportunities for social mobility based on professional competence rather than willingness to die. For royal employers, the losers were equally clear. Traditional funeral industry professionals who had specialized in large-scale human sacrifice arrangements, conservative priests whose authority had been based on managing elaborate death ceremonies, and nobles who had used participation in royal burial arrangements as markers of social status. These groups found themselves either adapting to new professional requirements or being gradually marginalized by institutional changes. The new rules and norms that governed royal burial practices were sophisticated and comprehensive. Pharaohs were still buried with elaborate symbolic representations of their royal household, but these representations took the form of detailed tomb reliefs, sophisticated sculpture, and carefully curated grave goods rather than actual people. The theological requirements for maintaining divine authority in the afterlife were satisfied through symbolic rather than literal interpretation of religious texts. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the careful balance the Egyptians had to maintain during this transformation. The fundamental concept of divine kingship remained intact. Pharaohs were still considered gods who required appropriate afterlife accommodations. The elaborate religious ceremonies surrounding royal death continued, but were refocused on symbolic rather than literal eternal employment arrangements. The social hierarchy that justified royal burial privileges was preserved, but was expressed through artistic and architectural sophistication rather than human sacrifice. The economic implications of these changes were immediately beneficial. Egypt could maintain royal burial traditions without the massive personnel costs that had characterized earlier periods. The political benefits were equally significant. Succession transitions became smoother when they didn't require elaborate human sacrifice arrangements. And royal authority was actually strengthened by association with more sophisticated and less barbaric cultural practices. Perhaps most importantly, the new system was scalable and sustainable in ways that the traditional approach had never been. Future pharaohs could maintain divine legitimacy without bankrupting the kingdom or decimating their administrative workforce, which created the foundation for Egyptian political stability that would last for centuries. Was this change actually an improvement? From a modern perspective, the answer seems obvious. Any system that reduces human sacrifice and improves governmental efficiency while maintaining cultural continuity is clearly superior to its predecessor. But evaluating this transformation from ancient Egyptian perspectives reveals more complex considerations about the relationship between religious authenticity, political effectiveness, and social stability. Different perspectives on the burial reform reflect the various constituencies that were affected by the changes. Royal administrators and military leaders generally viewed the transformation as positive, since it allowed them to pursue successful careers without facing mandatory death as a performance bonus. Progressive priests supported the changes as evidence of theological sophistication and religious evolution. Conservative religious authorities and traditional nobles, however, often viewed the reforms as evidence of declining royal legitimacy and cultural decay. The short-term effects of burial reform were largely positive. Egypt experienced improved political stability, more efficient resource allocation, and enhanced international reputation as governmental practices became less associated with large-scale human sacrifice. The immediate benefits included smoother succession transitions, better retention of skilled administrators, and improved economic performance, as resources were redirected from elaborate death ceremonies to practical governance needs. Long-term effects were more complex and sometimes contradictory. While the burial reforms contributed to Egyptian political stability and cultural sophistication, they also gradually weakened some of the psychological and religious foundations of absolute royal authority. When pharaohs could no longer demonstrate their divine power through control over life and death, they had to rely more heavily on administrative competence and military success, which made them more accountable to practical performance standards. The unintended consequences of burial reform included gradual democratization of afterlife accommodations, as simplified royal burial practices made elaborate tomb preparations more accessible to non-royal elites. This cultural diffusion eventually led to the development of middle-class mummification services and standardized funeral procedures that would define Egyptian death culture for centuries. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals interesting differences in evaluation criteria. Contemporary Egyptians probably viewed the burial reforms primarily in terms of religious legitimacy and political effectiveness, while modern observers tend to focus on humanitarian considerations and administrative efficiency. Both perspectives recognize the transformation as successful, but for different reasons. Ancient Egyptians, because it preserved royal authority while reducing costs. Modern observers, because it reduced human sacrifice while improving governance. The ultimate assessment of this change depends on how you weigh religious tradition against practical governance, cultural continuity against humanitarian concerns, and short-term stability against long-term institutional development. In the centuries that followed the Great Burial Reform, Egyptian royal death culture evolved like a successful tech startup that had finally figured out its business model. Except, instead of disrupting the transportation industry, they had disrupted the eternal employment sector. The New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, represented the golden age of sustainable royal death practices, when the Egyptians had perfected the art of looking divinely legitimate without actually killing anyone unnecessarily. The new challenges that emerged were fascinating in their complexity and occasionally ridiculous in their specificity. Foreign pharaohs, particularly during periods of Nubian and Persian rule, had to figure out how to maintain Egyptian burial traditions while also satisfying their own cultural expectations about royal death. This led to some truly creative theological compromises, including burial arrangements that incorporated multiple religious traditions and the occasional diplomatic crisis over which gods would be responsible for afterlife administration. The evolution of the burial system during this period was driven by Egypt's increasing integration into the broader Mediterranean world. Pharaohs who ruled an international empire couldn't maintain the kind of isolated, self-contained burial practices that had worked for earlier dynasties. They needed funeral arrangements that would be comprehensible to foreign allies, impressive to international visitors, and sophisticated enough to maintain Egyptian cultural prestige in an increasingly competitive world. Second-generation effects of the burial reforms included the democratization of elaborate afterlife preparations. Once royal burial practices had been simplified and systematized, the techniques and technologies developed for pharaonic tombs became available to wealthy non-royal Egyptians. This created what was essentially a luxury death care market, where successful merchants, administrators, and priests could purchase scaled-down versions of royal afterlife accommodations. The religious implications of these developments were equally significant. The theological innovations that had been developed to justify simplified royal burials gradually influenced broader Egyptian religious thought, leading to more sophisticated concepts of afterlife judgment, personal moral responsibility, and the relationship between earthly success and eternal reward. The pharaohs had accidentally started a religious reformation by trying to solve their human resources problems. Perhaps most importantly, the new burial system had to adapt to the realities of ruling a multicultural empire. Egyptian pharaohs of the new kingdom governed territories that included Nubians, Asiatics, and various Mediterranean peoples, each with their own ideas about appropriate royal death practices. This required developing burial arrangements that could satisfy Egyptian theological requirements while also demonstrating respect for foreign cultural sensibilities. Essentially, the ancient equivalent of international business etiquette applied to funeral planning. The economic effects continued to ripple through Egyptian society as the death care industry became increasingly professionalized and commercialized. What had once been royal monopoly services, mummification, tomb construction, ritual performance, were now available to anyone who could afford them, creating new opportunities for social mobility and economic development while also creating new forms of social stratification based on the quality of one's afterlife arrangements. The institutional changes in royal burial practices created opportunities for entirely new categories of people to influence Egyptian death culture, from international diplomatic specialists to religious entrepreneurs who could navigate the complex theological requirements of multicultural funeral arrangements. Queen Hatshepsut represents perhaps the most innovative player in New Kingdom burial politics. As a female pharaoh ruling in a system designed around male divine kingship, she had to develop entirely new approaches to royal burial that could maintain her legitimacy while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of her reign. Her burial arrangements included theological innovations that redefined the relationship between gender and divine authority, architectural innovations that created new models for royal tomb design, and administrative innovations that established precedents for female participation in traditionally male royal privileges. Hatshepsut's approach to royal death planning was essentially a masterclass in political branding applied to afterlife logistics. She couldn't simply adopt traditional male pharaonic burial practices without raising questions about her legitimacy. But she also couldn't create entirely new burial traditions without undermining the theological foundations of royal authority. Her solution involved developing burial arrangements that honored traditional divine kingship concepts while incorporating innovative elements that reflected her unique position as a female pharaoh. Senenmut, her chief architect and possible romantic partner, played a crucial role in developing these innovations. His tomb design work for Hatshepsut required solving unprecedented theological and practical problems. How do you create burial arrangements for a female pharaoh who claims male royal privileges? How do you design afterlife accommodations that satisfy traditional religious requirements while acknowledging innovative political realities? How do you manage the logistics of royal death planning when the traditional administrative structures assume male succession? The foreign pharaohs who ruled Egypt during various periods brought entirely different perspectives to royal burial practices. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty had to balance their own cultural traditions with Egyptian expectations, leading to burial arrangements that incorporated both Nubian and Egyptian religious elements. These pharaohs faced the challenge of maintaining legitimacy in Egypt while also satisfying their Nubian supporters, which required developing funeral practices that could function in both cultural contexts. Perhaps most fascinating were the Ptolemaic pharaohs, Greek-speaking Macedonians who ruled Egypt for 3 centuries while maintaining traditional Egyptian burial practices they probably didn't fully understand. The Ptolemies had to learn Egyptian royal death culture as foreign transplants, leading to burial arrangements that were sometimes more traditionally Egyptian than those of native pharaohs. They were essentially method actors playing pharaohs, and their commitment to the role extended to elaborate mummification and traditional burial ceremonies performed by people who spoke Greek at home and worshipped Egyptian gods at work. The religious specialists who emerged during this period included international theological consultants who could navigate the complex requirements of multicultural funeral arrangements. These priests and administrators had to understand not just Egyptian religious traditions, but also the expectations of foreign allies, subject peoples, and international visitors who might attend royal funeral ceremonies. They were essentially developing the ancient equivalent of interfaith funeral services, except the faiths involved included multiple national religions and the deceased was supposed to be a god. Their contributions to Egyptian death culture included theological innovations that made royal burial practices more flexible and adaptable, administrative systems that could handle the complex logistics of international funeral ceremonies, and diplomatic protocols that could manage the political implications of royal death in an imperial context. But some problems persisted throughout the evolution of Egyptian burial practices, proving that even the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems can't solve fundamental contradictions between theological ideals and practical realities. The New Kingdom pharaohs discovered that while you can reform royal burial practices, you can't completely escape the underlying tensions between divine authority claims and human resource management. The continuing challenge of succession planning remained one of the most persistent issues facing Egyptian royal death culture. Even with simplified burial arrangements, royal death still created potential political crises when succession wasn't clear, when designated heirs were children or otherwise unsuitable, or when competing claimants emerged with different ideas about appropriate burial arrangements. The pharaohs had solved the human sacrifice problem, but they hadn't solved the fundamental problem of how to maintain political continuity across generational transitions. New versions of old problems emerged as the burial system evolved. Instead of worrying about mass human sacrifice, New kingdom administrators had to manage the political implications of increasingly elaborate symbolic burial arrangements. Pharaohs competed with each other to create more impressive afterlife accommodations, leading to what we might call symbolic burial inflation. Each successive pharaoh needed more elaborate tomb decorations, more sophisticated religious ceremonies, and more expensive grave goods to maintain the prestige associated with divine kingship. The cyclical patterns that appeared in Egyptian burial practices reveal fascinating details about how institutional systems respond to external pressures. Periods of foreign rule typically led to more traditional burial arrangements as pharaohs tried to establish legitimacy through cultural conservatism. Periods of internal strength often coincided with innovative burial practices as confident pharaohs experimented with new approaches to royal death. Economic crises usually resulted in simplified burial arrangements, regardless of pharaonic preferences, demonstrating the persistent influence of practical constraints on religious and political ideals. Religious orthodoxy versus innovation remained a constant source of tension throughout Egyptian history. Conservative priests argued for maintaining traditional burial practices as evidence of cultural continuity and religious authenticity, while innovative religious thinkers advocated for theological development that could address changing political and social circumstances. These debates influenced royal burial planning in ways that sometimes created conflicts between pharaonic preferences and priestly recommendations. The international dimensions of these ongoing issues became increasingly important as Egypt became more integrated into the broader Mediterranean world. Egyptian pharaohs had to consider how their burial practices would be perceived by foreign allies, trading partners, and potential enemies. Burial arrangements that satisfied Egyptian theological requirements might appear barbaric or primitive to Greek or Roman observers, while arrangements that impressed international audiences might seem insufficiently traditional to Egyptian conservatives. Perhaps most persistently problematic was the fundamental contradiction between the democratic implications of burial reform and the authoritarian requirements of divine kingship. As burial practices became more accessible to non-royal Egyptians, the symbolic distinctions that justified pharaonic authority became more difficult to maintain. When wealthy merchants could afford mummification and elaborate tombs, what made pharaonic burial arrangements special enough to justify absolute political power? Why certain issues proved intractable reveals important insights about the limitations of institutional reform in pre-modern societies. Some problems, like succession, planning, and resource allocation, could be addressed through administrative innovation and bureaucratic efficiency. Other problems, like the theological contradictions inherent in divine kingship claims and the social tensions created by extreme inequality, were embedded too deeply in Egyptian cultural foundations to be resolved through burial reform alone. Compared to earlier periods of Egyptian history, the later developments in royal burial practices reveal both the adaptability and the limitations of institutional reform in ancient societies. The New Kingdom pharaohs had successfully modernized their approach to royal death, but they had also discovered that modernization created new challenges that were sometimes as complex as the problems they had solved. What was unique about Egyptian burial evolution was the sophisticated way the system adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity. Unlike other ancient civilizations that experienced radical discontinuities in royal burial practices during periods of political change, the Egyptians developed evolutionary approaches that could accommodate foreign rule, religious innovation, and social change without abandoning the fundamental concepts that justified their political system. Compared to contemporary civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Aegean, and the Levant, Egyptian burial practices were remarkably stable and sophisticated. While other cultures experienced dramatic shifts between elaborate, royal burials and simplified arrangements, depending on political circumstances, the Egyptians maintained consistent approaches that balanced religious requirements with practical constraints. They were essentially running the ancient world's most successful death care franchise, with standardized procedures that could be adapted to local circumstances while maintaining brand consistency. What was universal about the Pharaohs could be adapted to local circumstances while maintaining brand consistency. What was universal about the Egyptian experience was the persistent tension between religious ideals and practical governance that affected all ancient societies. Every civilization that claimed divine authority for its rulers had to address similar challenges about succession planning, resource allocation, and the relationship between ceremonial requirements and administrative efficiency. The Egyptians were simply more systematic and bureaucratic in their approach to these universal problems. The lessons that could be learned from Egyptian burial evolution include insights about institutional reform, cultural adaptation, and the relationship between religious authority and political effectiveness. The Egyptians demonstrated that even deeply embedded cultural practices could be modified through careful planning, gradual implementation, and sophisticated theological justification. They also showed that successful institutional reform required balancing innovation with tradition, efficiency with legitimacy, and practical concerns with symbolic requirements. The patterns that repeated elsewhere in the ancient world suggest that the Egyptian approach to burial reform represented broader human strategies for managing the tension between cultural tradition and practical necessity. Similar evolutionary patterns appeared in other ancient civilizations when they faced comparable challenges about royal authority, resource allocation, and cultural adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, the Egyptian experience demonstrated that institutional reform could succeed even in societies with strong authoritarian traditions and deeply embedded religious practices, provided that reform was implemented gradually, justified thoroughly, and adapted carefully to local circumstances and cultural values. By the late Ptolemaic period, around 100 BCE, the signs pointing to the end of traditional Egyptian royal burial practices were becoming impossible to ignore, like watching a once prestigious company slowly realize that their entire business model had become obsolete. The elaborate system of divine kingship burial that had sustained Egyptian civilization for over 3 millennia was showing clear symptoms of what we might call institutional arthritis, still functional, but increasingly stiff, expensive, and poorly adapted to contemporary realities. The warning signs were both obvious and subtle, depending on how closely you were paying attention to the cosmic bureaucracy. Obvious signs included the fact that Ptolemaic pharaohs were increasingly buried in Alexandria rather than traditional royal necropolises, that their burial arrangements incorporated more Greek and Roman elements than traditional Egyptian practices, and that the theological justifications for pharaonic divine authority were being challenged by alternative religious systems that didn't require quite so much administrative overhead for royal death planning. More subtle warning signs included the gradual professionalization of royal burial services to the point where they had become routine administrative procedures rather than cosmically significant events. When your divine king's eternal employment arrangements are being handled by mid-level bureaucrats using standardized forms, the mystique of divine kingship has probably been somewhat compromised. The pharaohs had succeeded in making royal burial practices efficient and sustainable, but they had also accidentally made them mundane. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals fascinating details about how institutional decline happens even in societies with sophisticated administrative systems. The Ptolemaic pharaohs clearly understood that their burial practices needed to adapt to changing political circumstances, hence their adoption of Hellenistic elements and their willingness to modify traditional arrangements. But they apparently didn't realize that these adaptations were gradually undermining the theological foundations that made pharaonic authority legitimate in the first place. The priests and administrators who managed royal burial logistics could see the practical challenges facing traditional arrangements: rising costs, declining public interest, competition from alternative religious systems, and the logistical difficulties of maintaining elaborate burial practices in an increasingly cosmopolitan environment. What they missed was that their successful solutions to these practical problems were creating new theoretical problems about the nature of divine kingship itself. Resistance to inevitable change came from predictable sources, but took surprisingly creative forms. Conservative priests developed increasingly elaborate theological justifications for maintaining traditional burial practices, essentially doubling down on religious orthodoxy as a response to cultural change. Traditional craftsmen and funeral industry professionals lobbied for government support to maintain their specialized skills and traditional employment opportunities. Even some Ptolemaic pharaohs themselves resisted change, apparently believing that more elaborate burial preparations could somehow restore the divine authority that was being eroded by broader cultural and political developments. The final chapter of traditional Egyptian royal burial practices played out like a slow-motion corporate takeover, where the acquiring company gradually replaces all the original management, while insisting that nothing fundamental has really changed. When Augustus became the first Roman emperor of Egypt in 30 BCE, after defeating Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, he didn't immediately abolish pharaonic burial traditions. He simply made them irrelevant through administrative efficiency and cultural indifference. The specific events that marked the end of the traditional system were less dramatic than you might expect for the conclusion of a 3,000-year-old institution. Instead of grand gestures or definitive policy announcements, the Egyptian royal burial system ended through bureaucratic neglect and gradual substitution of Roman administrative practices for traditional Egyptian arrangements. It was death by 1,000 budget cuts and procedural modifications. The final major players in this transition included Cleopatra VII, who represented the last serious attempt to maintain traditional pharaonic authority through elaborate royal burial planning, and Augustus, who represented the new Roman approach of treating pharaonic titles as administrative conveniences rather than cosmic realities. Cleopatra's burial preparations had included traditional Egyptian elements designed to maintain her divine legitimacy, but her actual death and burial became Roman political theater rather than Egyptian religious ceremony. Augustus's approach to Egyptian royal burial traditions was masterfully dismissive. He didn't attack them directly, which might have created martyrs or resistance movements, but simply ignored them while implementing Roman alternatives that were more efficient and less theologically complicated. The Romans were essentially replacing divine kingship with professional management, and professional management didn't require elaborate death planning, because professional managers were supposed to be replaceable, the last attempts to preserve. Traditional burial practices came from Egyptian priests and traditional nobles, who understood that the end of pharaonic burial traditions would mean the end of the entire cultural system that had sustained their authority for millennia. Some priests attempted to maintain traditional mummification and burial ceremonies for Ptolemaic royal family members even after Roman conquest, but these efforts became increasingly disconnected from actual political power and gradually devolved into nostalgic cultural preservation rather than functional religious practice. The dramatic final moments of the traditional system were more bureaucratic than theatrical. Roman administrators simply stopped funding elaborate royal burial preparations, transferred responsibility for Egyptian royal tombs to Roman municipal authorities, and began treating pharaonic burial sites as tourist attractions rather than active religious centers. the cosmic bureaucracy that had managed Egyptian royal death for 3,000 years was essentially downsized into a heritage tourism department. Perhaps most tellingly, the gradual decline of traditional burial practices coincided with the rise of alternative religious systems that offered afterlife benefits without requiring elaborate royal mediation. Christianity, in particular, provided frameworks for eternal life that didn't depend on pharaonic divine authority or elaborate burial preparations. When ordinary Egyptians could achieve eternal salvation through religious conversion rather than royal service, the entire justification for elaborate pharaonic burial arrangements became obsolete. The symbolic endpoints of the traditional system are difficult to identify precisely because the decline was so gradual and bureaucratic. Some historians point to the last traditional pharaonic mummification, others to the abandonment of royal necropolis maintenance, and still others to the conversion of pharaonic burial sites into Roman administrative facilities. But perhaps the most accurate symbolic endpoint was when Egyptian royal burial practices became museum exhibitions rather than active religious ceremonies. The moment when pharaonic death culture became historical artifact rather than contemporary practice. Archaeological evidence suggests that traditional burial practices continued in modified forms well into the Roman period. But these were essentially cultural reenactments rather than functional religious and political ceremonies. The elaborate theological frameworks that had justified pharaonic burial practices were still intellectually available, but they were no longer institutionally relevant to actual governance or religious practice in Roman Egypt. The collapse of traditional Egyptian royal burial practices resulted from a perfect storm of cultural, economic, and political factors that made the entire system simultaneously too expensive to maintain and too irrelevant to justify. Unlike earlier challenges that had led to adaptation and reform, the Roman conquest represented a fundamental incompatibility between Egyptian divine kingship concepts and Roman administrative efficiency that couldn't be resolved through theological innovation or bureaucratic creativity. The internal problems that contributed to the system's decline had been building for centuries but became critical under Roman rule. The elaborate burial practices that had been designed to demonstrate pharaonic divine authority had become so expensive and logistically complex that they consumed resources that could have been used for more practical governance needs. The Ptolemaic pharaohs had maintained these practices through foreign taxation and tribute, but Roman administration operated according to different principles that prioritized economic efficiency over ceremonial demonstration of authority. External pressures included the rise of alternative religious systems that offered competing frameworks for understanding death, divine authority, and eternal life. Christianity, in particular, provided theological alternatives to Egyptian divine kingship that were more accessible to ordinary people and less dependent on elaborate royal burial arrangements. When religious salvation became available through personal faith rather than royal mediation, the entire justification for pharaonic burial privileges was undermined. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending the burial system reveals fascinating details about how institutional change happens in conquered societies. Individual Roman administrators like Augustus and his successors actively promoted policies that marginalized traditional Egyptian practices, but their success depended on broader historical trends that had already weakened the cultural foundations of divine kingship. The Romans didn't destroy Egyptian burial traditions so much as they provided more attractive alternatives that made those traditions irrelevant. What could have been done differently is a complex question that involves both practical and theoretical considerations. The Ptolemaic pharaohs might have been more successful in maintaining their burial traditions if they had developed more sustainable approaches to royal death that didn't require such enormous resource commitments. Alternatively, they might have been more successful if they had developed theological frameworks that could accommodate Roman political authority while maintaining Egyptian cultural distinctiveness. The inevitability versus contingency debate about the end of Egyptian burial practices reflects broader questions about cultural change and institutional survival. Some historians argue that the collision between Egyptian divine kingship and Roman administrative efficiency made the collapse of traditional burial practices inevitable, regardless of specific political circumstances. Others contend that different approaches to cultural adaptation might have allowed traditional practices to survive in modified forms, pointing to examples from other conquered societies where indigenous cultural practices successfully adapted to foreign rule. Perhaps most importantly, the end of Egyptian royal burial practices demonstrated the limitations of institutional reform in preserving cultural systems that are fundamentally incompatible with changing political and economic realities. The Egyptians had successfully adapted their burial practices to accommodate internal political changes, economic pressures, and even foreign rule. But they couldn't adapt to a fundamental shift in the underlying assumptions about the relationship between political authority, religious legitimacy, and cultural identity. That the Roman approach to governance simply didn't require elaborate royal burial arrangements. And once those arrangements were no longer politically necessary, their enormous costs and logistical complexity made them unsustainable regardless of their cultural significance or historical importance. The immediate aftermath of the traditional burial system's collapse was surprisingly orderly, considering that Egypt was abandoning cultural practices that had defined its identity for 3 millennia. The Romans had learned from earlier imperial experiences that successful conquest required replacing indigenous institutions gradually rather than dramatically, and their approach to Egyptian burial traditions reflected this sophisticated understanding of cultural management, who stepped into the cultural vacuum left by the end of pharaonic burial practices were primarily Roman administrators who treated Egyptian death culture as a local curiosity rather than a cosmic necessity, and Christian religious leaders who offered alternative frameworks for understanding death and eternal life that didn't require royal mediation. The transition was remarkably smooth because the Romans provided practical alternatives to the services that pharaonic burial arrangements had traditionally provided. The short-term consequences included the conversion of royal necropolis sites into Roman municipal facilities, the retraining of traditional Egyptian burial industry professionals for Roman funeral practices, and the gradual integration of simplified Egyptian mummification techniques into Roman death culture. Instead of eliminating Egyptian burial practices entirely, the Romans essentially commercialized and democratized them, making mummification and elaborate tomb preparation available to anyone who could afford them rather than restricting these services to royal clients. Contemporary reactions to the end of traditional burial practices were mixed, but generally pragmatic. Most Egyptians apparently adapted to Roman funeral arrangements without significant resistance, suggesting that the practical benefits of Roman rule outweighed the cultural losses associated with abandoned burial traditions. Some Egyptian priests and traditional nobles maintained nostalgic attachment to pharaonic burial practices, but these groups represented a small minority of the population and had limited political influence under Roman administration. The attempts at revival or continuation of traditional practices were largely unsuccessful, primarily because they lacked institutional support and popular demand. Without pharaohs who needed elaborate burial arrangements, the entire industry and cultural framework that is sustained royal death practices became economically and politically irrelevant. The legacy of Egyptian pharaonic burial practices shaped later civilizations in ways that are both obvious and surprisingly subtle, creating influences that rippled through history like the world's most persistent cultural franchise. the specific innovations that emerged from 3 millennia of creative problem-solving around royal death became foundational elements of Western civilization's approach to power, ceremony, and the relationship between individual authority and institutional continuity. The most immediate historical impact was on funeral industry development throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman adoption of Egyptian mummification techniques and elaborate tomb preparation services created the first international death care industry, complete with standardized procedures, professional training programs, and quality control systems that wouldn't look out of place in a modern corporate environment. The Egyptians had essentially invented the business model for luxury funeral services, and that model spread throughout the ancient world with remarkable consistency. Later generations viewed Egyptian burial practices through increasingly romantic and mystical lenses that often obscured the practical administrative realities that had actually driven their development. Medieval European kings adopted elaborate funeral ceremonies that were directly inspired by Egyptian precedents, but they interpreted these practices as expressions of divine monarchy rather than solutions to bureaucratic challenges. The theological frameworks that have been developed to justify symbolic representation in royal burials influenced Christian concepts of symbolic communion and ritual representation that became central to European religious practice. The myths versus realities that developed around Egyptian burial practices created one of history's most persistent examples of cultural misunderstanding becoming cultural influence. Popular understanding of Egyptian royal burials focused on romantic ideas about eternal love and mystical religious practices, while the actual historical development had been driven by practical concerns about resource allocation, succession planning, and administrative efficiency. These myths became so influential that they shaped how later civilizations approached their own royal burial planning, leading to practices that were sometimes more Egyptian than anything the actual Egyptians had ever done. Renaissance interest in Egyptian burial practices contributed to the development of elaborate state funeral ceremonies that became standard features of European monarchy. The symbolic representation techniques that had been developed to solve Egyptian human sacrifice problems were adapted to create ceremonial frameworks that could demonstrate royal authority without requiring actual divine kingship claims. European kings essentially borrowed Egyptian ceremonial innovations while adapting them to Christian theological frameworks and contemporary political realities. The archaeological rediscovery of Egyptian burial sites during the 18th and 19th centuries created new forms of cultural influence that were sometimes more powerful than the original historical impact. Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, the decipherment of hieroglyphs, and the discovery of intact royal tombs like Tutankhamun's created popular fascination with Egyptian death culture that influenced everything from architectural design to popular entertainment. The Egyptians became posthumously famous for burial practices that they had actually been trying to simplify and rationalize for most of their history. Why Egyptian burial practices remained important to later generations reflects both their genuine innovations and their symbolic power as representations of sophisticated approaches to fundamental human challenges. The Egyptians had developed systematic solutions to problems that every complex society faces: how to maintain institutional continuity across leadership transitions, how to balance ceremonial requirements with practical governance needs, and how to manage the relationship between individual authority and collective social organization. These weren't uniquely Egyptian problems, but the Egyptian solutions were uniquely sophisticated and well documented, making them attractive models for later civilizations facing similar challenges. Today, we can see echoes of ancient Egyptian burial planning in everything from corporate succession planning to modern state funeral protocols, revealing that the fundamental challenges the Egyptians faced in managing royal death have never actually been solved, just adapted to contemporary circumstances with varying degrees of success and occasional spectacular failure. The most obvious modern parallel appears in how contemporary societies handle the deaths of prominent leaders and public figures. State funerals for presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs follow organizational patterns that would be immediately recognizable to ancient Egyptian burial planners. Elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate institutional continuity, careful choreography of symbolic representation, and massive logistical coordination to manage public participation while maintaining appropriate dignity. The main difference is that modern state funerals don't typically include provisions for eternal employment, though some political appointees might argue that lifetime diplomatic posts come pretty close. Corporate succession planning represents perhaps the most direct parallel to ancient Egyptian approaches to royal death. Modern corporations face identical challenges in managing leadership transitions while maintaining institutional authority, stakeholder confidence, and operational continuity. The elaborate succession planning processes used by major corporations, detailed organizational charts, carefully planned transition ceremonies, symbolic transfer of authority, and comprehensive stakeholder communication strategies are essentially updated versions of the bureaucratic innovations that Egyptian administrators developed to manage pharaonic succession without chaos. The modern funeral industry itself is a direct descendant of innovations that emerged from Egyptian royal burial practices. Contemporary funeral homes offer scaled versions of services that were originally developed for pharaonic burials. Professional embalming, elaborate ceremony planning, customized memorial services, and comprehensive grief support that help families manage the transition from life to death. The business model is essentially the same, charging premium prices for elaborate ceremonies that provide psychological comfort and social status while managing the practical challenges of death. Modern celebrity culture provides fascinating parallels to ancient Egyptian approaches to managing public figures who claim special status and require special treatment even in death. Celebrity funerals often involve the same kind of elaborate planning, symbolic representation, and public ceremony that characterized pharaonic burials, just without the theological framework of divine kingship. When major celebrities die, the funeral arrangements become public events that demonstrate social hierarchies, cultural values, and institutional relationships in ways that would be immediately comprehensible to ancient Egyptian observers. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes particularly clear when you examine modern approaches to wealth, power, and death. Contemporary billionaires and political leaders demonstrate the same impulses toward elaborate death preparation that drove Egyptian pharaonic burial practices. The desire to maintain control beyond death, the need to demonstrate status through expensive ceremony, and the fantasy that sufficient wealth can somehow overcome the fundamental limitations of human mortality. Modern mausoleums, elaborate estate planning, and celebrity burial grounds represent contemporary versions of pharaonic tomb complexes, just with different architectural styles and legal frameworks. Similar patterns in different contexts appear throughout modern society. Military funeral honors for high-ranking officers follow organizational principles that directly parallel Egyptian approaches to burying royal military commanders. Academic memorial services for distinguished professors involve ceremonial elements, symbolic representation of scholarly achievements, institutional recognition of intellectual authority, and careful management of succession within academic hierarchies that mirror the bureaucratic innovations developed for Egyptian royal burial planning. The lessons for contemporary issues are both practical and philosophical. Modern societies can learn from Egyptian innovations in institutional continuity planning, ceremonial design, and the management of succession transitions. But they can also learn from Egyptian mistakes about the relationship between elaborate ceremony and effective governance, the economic costs of status-based resource allocation, and the risks of developing institutional practices that become too expensive or logistically complex to maintain during crisis periods. Perhaps most importantly, contemporary societies can learn from the Egyptian experience about the importance of balancing symbolic requirements with practical constraints, maintaining cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances, and managing the persistent tension between individual authority and institutional effectiveness that affects every organization, from corporations to governments to religious institutions. Even now, ancient Egyptian burial practices continue to influence contemporary culture in ways that range from obvious tourism, marketing to subtle psychological frameworks that shape how modern people think about death, authority, and the relationship between individual achievement and institutional recognition. Academic study of Egyptian burial practices has become a specialized field that influences everything from archaeological methodology to religious studies, anthropology, and political science. Universities offer courses in Egyptian death culture that attract students interested in understanding how complex societies manage fundamental transitions, and the research methods developed for studying Egyptian burial sites have become standard. Approaches for archaeological investigation worldwide. Popular culture. Representations of Egyptian burial practices appear in everything from Hollywood movies to video games, theme park attractions, and fashion design. These contemporary interpretations often bear little resemblance to historical Egyptian practices, but they demonstrate the persistent cultural power of Egyptian innovations in ceremony, symbolism, and the aesthetic of elaborate death preparation. The Egyptian look has become an internationally recognized design motif that appears in architecture, interior design, and luxury product marketing. Political discourse continues to reference Egyptian burial practices as symbols of both sophisticated governmental organization and dangerous autocratic excess. Modern political commentators use pharaonic burial metaphors to describe everything, from excessive government spending to elaborate presidential transition planning, revealing that Egyptian practices remain culturally relevant as both positive and negative examples of how societies can manage institutional authority. Social movements interested in death reform, funeral industry criticism, and alternative approaches to end-of-life planning often reference Egyptian innovations as examples of how societies can develop creative solutions to death-related challenges while maintaining cultural meaning and social cohesion. The Egyptian experience provides evidence that even deeply embedded cultural practices can be reformed through careful planning and gradual implementation. Why people still care about ancient Egyptian burial practices reflects their continued relevance to fundamental human concerns about mortality, authority, social organization, and the relationship between individual achievement and institutional continuity that remain as challenging today as they were 3,000 years ago. The enduring fascination with Egyptian pharaonic burial practices ultimately reflects something deeper than simple historical curiosity or exotic cultural tourism. These ancient innovations in managing royal death speak to persistent human struggles with mortality, authority, and the eternal question of how individuals and institutions can maintain meaning and continuity across the fundamental discontinuity of death. What makes the Egyptian experience particularly compelling for contemporary audiences is the combination of sophisticated problem-solving and human-scale emotional concerns that characterize their approach to royal burial planning. The Egyptians weren't just developing elaborate ceremonies or creating impressive monuments. They were trying to solve practical problems about governance, succession, resource allocation, and social organization while also addressing fundamental Human anxieties about death, legacy, and the meaning of individual achievement within larger institutional context. The 3,000-year evolution of Egyptian burial practices provides a unique historical laboratory for understanding how complex societies adapt cultural practices to changing circumstances while maintaining institutional continuity and cultural identity. The Egyptian experience demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of institutional reform, showing how even deeply embedded cultural practices can be modified through careful planning, while also revealing the constraints that practical realities place on cultural innovation. Perhaps most importantly, the Egyptian approach to royal death illustrates the persistent tension between individual authority and collective social organization that remains one of the central challenges facing modern democratic societies. The Egyptians developed sophisticated frameworks for managing this tension through ceremonial representation, bureaucratic innovation, and theological creativity, but they never completely resolved the fundamental contradictions between individual power and institutional effectiveness that continue to challenge contemporary political systems. The legacy of Egyptian burial practices extends far beyond historical interest or cultural curiosity. These ancient innovations continue to influence how modern societies approach fundamental questions about leadership, succession, ceremony, and the relationship between individual achievement and collective social organization. Understanding how the Egyptians managed these challenges provides valuable insights for contemporary societies facing similar problems with different technological capabilities but identical human limitations. The story of Egyptian pharaonic burial practices is ultimately a story about human creativity in the face of universal constraints. How intelligent, ambitious people developed sophisticated solutions to fundamental problems while working within the limitations imposed by mortality, resource scarcity, and the persistent challenges of social organization that define the human experience across all historical periods and cultural contexts. Looking back across 3 millennia of Egyptian royal burial practices, we've witnessed one of humanity's most ambitious and sustained experiments in institutional problem solving, a civilization-long effort to balance the competing demands of religious legitimacy, political effectiveness, and basic human survival that would make modern organizational consultants weep with admiration and occasionally horror. The key patterns that emerge throughout this long journey reveal fascinating consistencies in how intelligent people respond to impossible situations. When faced with theological requirements that conflict with practical governance needs, the Egyptians consistently chose evolution over revolution, developing sophisticated workarounds rather than abandoning foundational concepts. When confronted with economic constraints that threatened cultural practices, they innovated rather than capitulated, creating symbolic alternatives that maintain meaning while reducing costs. When challenged by external pressures that questioned their traditional approaches, they adapted rather than resisted, demonstrating remarkable flexibility within seemingly rigid institutional frameworks. The most surprising discoveries along the way have been the persistent humanity underlying even the most elaborate and seemingly bizarre cultural practices. The Egyptian approach to royal death wasn't driven by primitive superstition or autocratic megalomania. It was motivated by recognizable human concerns about job security, succession planning, resource allocation, and the eternal challenge of maintaining institutional authority across generational transitions. The pharaohs and their administrators were essentially running the ancient world's most complex human resources department, dealing with employment policies that happen to extend into eternity. The most important takeaways from this extended examination of Egyptian burial practices include insights about institutional adaptation, cultural resilience, and the relationship between individual authority and collective social organization that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The Egyptians demonstrated that even deeply embedded cultural practices can be reformed through careful planning and gradual implementation. But they also showed the limitations that practical constraints place on cultural innovation and the persistent tensions between symbolic requirements and operational effectiveness. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reflects both the complexity of Egyptian civilization and the challenge of interpreting ancient practices through modern analytical frameworks. What initially appeared to be simple examples of autocratic excess or primitive religious practice revealed themselves to be sophisticated solutions to universal human problems, implemented through bureaucratic innovations that wouldn't look out of place in contemporary organizational management literature. The Egyptian experience ultimately illustrates the persistent creativity of human societies in developing institutional solutions to fundamental problems, while also demonstrating the constraints that mortality, resource scarcity, and social organization place on even the most ambitious cultural innovations. Their 3,000-year experiment in managing royal death provides both inspiration and cautionary lessons for contemporary societies facing similar challenges with different technological capabilities but identical human limitations. Perhaps no single story better encapsulates the entire Egyptian approach to royal burial than the tale of the anonymous scribe whose tomb inscription, discovered in a modest burial site near Memphis, reads simply, "I served 3 pharaohs, outlived 2 dynasties, and died in my own bed at the age of 73. I consider this a successful career." This unnamed administrator had somehow managed to navigate the complexities of royal service across multiple reigns and political upheavals while avoiding the eternal employment arrangements that claimed so many of his colleagues. Archaeological evidence suggests this scribe had worked in the royal burial planning department, helping to design the very eternal employment packages that he successfully avoided. His tomb contains detailed administrative records documenting funeral arrangements for multiple pharaohs, including cost estimates, personnel allocations, and what appeared to be efficiency recommendations for streamlining royal death procedures. He was essentially the ancient world's first funeral industry consultant, and his professional expertise had apparently taught him exactly how to avoid becoming a client. The scribe's burial arrangements reflect the sophisticated balance between cultural participation and personal survival that characterized the most successful Egyptian careers. His tomb includes traditional religious imagery demonstrating proper respect for pharaonic divine authority, but it's notably free of any references to eternal service or posthumous employment obligations. His grave goods include professional tools, writing implements, measuring devices, and administrative seals, rather than symbolic representations of eternal duties, suggesting that he viewed his afterlife as a well-deserved retirement rather than a career extension. What makes this story particularly poignant is how it reveals the human dimension underlying even the most elaborate institutional arrangements. This scribe had spent his career managing other people's eternal employment, while carefully ensuring his own eternal unemployment. He had been intimately involved in planning elaborate afterlife accommodations for divine rulers, while arranging modest but comfortable afterlife accommodations for himself. He understood the system well enough to make it work for him rather than against him. The broader significance of this anonymous administrator's story lies in how it connects to everything we've discussed about Egyptian burial practices. His successful career represents the triumph of practical intelligence over institutional pressure, individual survival over collective obligation, and professional competence over ceremonial grandeur. He had figured out how to serve power without being consumed by it, how to participate in cultural practices without being victimized by them, and how to maintain personal agency within institutional constraints. This story encapsulates the broader Themes of Egyptian burial evolution because it demonstrates how individual creativity and institutional adaptation could work together to solve seemingly impossible problems. Described success wasn't achieved through rebellion against Egyptian cultural practices or rejection of pharaonic authority. It was achieved through sophisticated understanding of how those practices actually worked and creative application of that understanding to personal circumstances. The memorable final image that emerges from this story is of a 73-year-old man dying peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by the administrative records of a successful career spent helping other people plan for eternity while ensuring his own temporal comfort. It's a perfect metaphor for the Egyptian approach to balancing competing demands: practical, sophisticated, slightly ironic, and ultimately very human. As we reach the end of our journey through 3,000 years of Egyptian royal burial practices, it's worth remembering that these ancient administrators, priests, and pharaohs were grappling with fundamentally timeless questions about mortality, authority, and the challenge of maintaining meaning across the inevitable transitions that define human experience. Their solutions were often elaborate, sometimes bizarre, and occasionally brilliant, but they were always deeply human responses to universal concerns. The Egyptians developed their complex burial practices not because they were obsessed with death, but because they were intensely focused on life, on maintaining the social, political, and cultural institutions that made civilized life possible. Across the fundamental discontinuity of individual mortality, tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you might reflect on the quiet persistence of human creativity in the face of impossible challenges, the remarkable ingenuity that ordinary people demonstrate when faced with extraordinary circumstances, and the comforting realization that even the most complex institutional problems usually yield to patient, practical problem-solving applied with sufficient intelligence and good humor. Sweet dreams, and remember, whatever challenges you're facing in your own life, at least you're not responsible for organizing eternal employment packages for divine rulers. Some problems, thankfully, belong to history.